The morning mist clung to the rooftops of Sarajevo like a shroud, masking the movements of those who had learned to kill in silence. In the distance, the crack of gunfire echoed through empty streets where children once played. But on this particular morning in 1993, something extraordinary was about to unfold. Something that would challenge everything the world thought it knew about war, about women, and about the deadly precision that can hide behind the most innocent face. Her neighbors knew her as the quiet librarian who helped their children with homework. Her colleagues saw her as the soft-spoken woman who organized book clubs and poetry readings. Even her own family had no idea that behind those gentle eyes lay the calculating mind of one of the most effective snipers the Bosnian War had ever seen. What happened in those crucial 18 minutes would not only change the course of a critical battle, but would also shatter every assumption about who becomes a killer in war. This is the story of a woman whose secret would remain buried for decades, a story of survival, precision, and the terrible choices we make when our world collapses around us. The enemy never saw her coming. They never suspected that their deaths would come from the hands of someone who, just hours before, had been reading fairy tales to neighborhood children. But war has a way of revealing who we truly are beneath the masks we wear. And on this day, 10 enemy soldiers would discover that the most dangerous predator is often the one you never see coming.
This is her story. Raw, unfiltered, and shocking in its simplicity.
A story that proves sometimes the most ordinary people are capable of the most extraordinary things. Maria Petkovic lived the kind of life that most people would describe as perfectly ordinary. Every morning at 7:30, she would walk the 6 blocks from her small apartment to the Sarajevo City Library, where she had worked as a senior librarian for the past 12 years. Her routine never varied much. She would unlock the heavy wooden doors, turn on the lights that illuminated thousands of books waiting patiently on their shelves, and begin her day by organizing the returns from the previous afternoon. The people of her neighborhood knew her well. She was the woman who would patiently help struggling students find research materials for their school projects. She was the one who organized the monthly book club meetings where local residents would gather to discuss everything from classic literature to contemporary novels. Children especially loved her because she had a gift for bringing stories to life, using different voices for each character, and making even the most reluctant young readers eager to discover what happened next. Maria was 34 years old when the first shells began falling on Sarajevo in April 1990. She had never married, though she had been engaged once to a medical student named Alexander, who had died in a car accident 3 years earlier. Since then, she had thrown herself into her work and her community, finding comfort in the predictable rhythms of library life and the quiet satisfaction that came from helping others discover the magic of books. Her apartment was a reflection of her personality, neat, organized, and filled with carefully chosen items that each told a story. The walls were lined with bookshelves containing her personal collection, accumulated over years of careful selection. She had first editions of several Yugoslav authors, poetry collections that she would read aloud to herself on quiet Sunday afternoons, and an extensive collection of children's books that she often borrowed for story time at the local school. What most people did not know about Marija was that she had grown up in a family with a strong military tradition. Her father, Colonel Nikola Petkovic, had served in the Yugoslav People's Army for 30 years before retiring in 1985. Her older brother Stefan had followed in their father's footsteps and was stationed with a peacekeeping unit in Cyprus when the war began. From a young age, Maria had been exposed to military discipline and precision in ways that most civilians never experience. During family vacations in the mountains, her father had taught both his children how to handle firearms. What started as a way to hunt for food during camping trips gradually evolved into more serious training. Marija had discovered that she possessed an unusual natural ability with rifles, an ability to control her breathing, steady her hands, and focus her mind in ways that allowed her to hit targets at distances that impressed even her military father. By the time she was 18, Marija could consistently hit targets at 400 meters with iron sights alone. Her father had been amazed by her precision and had often joked that she should consider joining the military. But Maria had always been drawn to books and learning, and the idea of making a career out of warfare had never appealed to her. She wanted to build things, not destroy them. She wanted to help people learn and grow, not learn how to kill. When Yugoslavia began to fracture in the early 1990s, Maria watched the news with growing concern, but tried to maintain her belief that diplomacy and reason would prevail. She attended peace rallies in Sarajevo, helped organize cultural events designed to bring different ethnic communities together, and continued her work at the library as if keeping the institution running might somehow help hold society together. The first signs of serious trouble came in March 1992, when barricades began appearing throughout the city. Maria noticed that fewer people were coming to the library, and those who did come seemed nervous and distracted. Children stopped attending storytime sessions. The book club meetings became smaller and more tense, with participants arguing about politics rather than discussing literature. On April 5, 1992, peace demonstrators were shot by snipers while marching through Sarajevo. Maria had been at the library when she heard the news, and she remembered the sick feeling in her stomach as she realized that her city was about to be consumed by the kind of violence she had only read about in history books. That night, she went home to her apartment and tried to continue her normal routine, but she found herself unable to concentrate on reading. The siege of Sarajevo began the next day. Maria woke to the sound of artillery shells exploding in the distance and the crack of small arms fire echoing through the streets. She looked out her window and saw smoke rising from several parts of the city. The phone lines were down, the electricity was sporadic, and suddenly the comfortable predictability of her life was gone forever. For the first few weeks of the siege, Maria tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. The library remained officially open, though very few people came. She spent her days reorganizing collections, repairing damaged books, and trying to protect the building's contents from potential shrapnel damage. She moved the most valuable books to the basement and covered the windows with whatever materials she could find. As the weeks turned into months, the situation in Sarajevo deteriorated rapidly. Food became scarce, utilities were unreliable, and the constant threat of sniper fire made it dangerous to move around the city during daylight hours. Maria watched her neighbors become gaunt and desperate, and she saw children who had once laughed at her stories now moving through the streets with the haunted expressions of people who had seen too much violence too early in their lives. The library became an unofficial shelter for people seeking refuge from the fighting. Marija found herself not just managing books, but helping to coordinate food distribution, providing first aid to the wounded, and trying to maintain morale among the 20 or 30 people who had taken up residence in the building's basement. She discovered that the organizational skills she had developed as a librarian were surprisingly applicable to crisis management. It was during this period that Marifa first began to think seriously about the military training her father had given her years earlier. Every day she could see enemy positions in the hills surrounding Sarajevo, and she could identify the locations from which sniper fire was coming. She began to study the patterns of enemy movement, noting when guards changed shifts, when supply convoys moved, and when targets of opportunity might present themselves. The transformation did not happen overnight. For months, Maria continued to think of herself primarily as a librarian who was temporarily displaced by war. She told herself that once the fighting ended, she would return to her books and her quiet life, and all of this would become just another chapter in the long history of human conflict. But as the siege dragged on and the suffering of her community deepened, she began to realize that waiting for others to end the war might not be enough. The turning point came in September 1992, when a mortar shell hit the school where she had conducted storytime sessions for nearly 8 years. 3 children were killed, including 7-year-old Anna Markovic, whose favorite book had been a collection of fairy tales that Maria had read to her dozens of times. When Maria heard the news, she sat in the library basement, surrounded by the books that had once represented everything she valued about human civilization. And she wept for the innocence that war had stolen, not just from the children of Sarajevo, but from herself. That night, she made a decision that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. She retrieved her father's old hunting rifle from the closet in her apartment, where it had remained unused since his death 3 years earlier. She cleaned and oiled the weapon with the careful precision her father had taught her, and she began to plan her transformation from librarian to sniper. The woman who had once helped children discover the magic of stories was about to write a very different kind of story. One measured not in pages and chapters, but in precise calculations of distance, wind speed, and the deadly mathematics of war. The rifle felt heavier than Maria remembered. Her father's old Zastava M70 hunting rifle had been designed for taking down deer and wild boar in the mountains of Bosnia, not for the deadly precision work she was now contemplating. But as she held the weapon in her hands for the first time in over 5 years, muscle memory began to return, and she found herself automatically checking the bolt action, examining the trigger mechanism, and testing the scope alignment with the practiced efficiency her father had drilled into her during countless hunting trips. Marija spent the first month simply observing. Every morning before dawn, she would climb to the highest accessible floor of the library building and position herself near a window that provided a clear view of the enemy positions in the hills above Sarajevo. She had learned from her father that successful hunting required patience above all else, understanding the habits and patterns of your target before ever taking a shot. The enemy snipers had established positions in several buildings that had once been part of the university complex. From her vantage point, Maria could see at least 3 separate shooting positions, and over the course of several weeks, she began to identify individual shooters based on their schedules, their preferred targets, and their shooting patterns. She kept detailed notes in the margins of library books, using a code she had developed to record movement patterns, shift changes, and behavioral observations. What struck her most during these early weeks of observation was how casual the enemy snipers had become. They moved around their positions during daylight hours with little concern for concealment, apparently confident that no one in the besieged city posed a serious threat to them. They would stand in windows, smoke cigarettes between shots, and sometimes even wave at each other across the distance between their positions. This overconfidence would prove to be their fatal weakness. Marija began her technical preparation with the methodical approach she had always applied to her library work. She calculated distances to various enemy positions using landmark references and mathematical triangulation. She studied weather patterns and wind conditions at different times of day, noting how atmospheric changes affected visibility and bullet trajectory. She even researched the specific ammunition available to her, testing different loads to determine which provided the most consistent accuracy at the ranges she would be engaging. The physical preparation was more challenging. Marija had always been in decent shape, but the demands of precision shooting required a level of physical control she had not maintained since her teenage years. She began a strict exercise routine focused on building core strength and improving her ability to remain motionless for extended periods. She practiced breathing exercises that would allow her to fire between heartbeats, and she worked on developing the mental discipline necessary to remain calm under extreme stress. Perhaps most importantly, she had to solve the problem of positioning and concealment. The library building provided excellent observation opportunities, but it would be suicide to actually fire from such an obvious location. Marija needed to find shooting positions that would allow her to engage targets and then disappear before return fire could locate her. This required extensive reconnaissance of the city's damaged buildings, sewers, and underground passages. Over the course of several weeks, Maria identified 7 different shooting positions throughout her neighborhood, each offering specific advantages for engaging different target areas. She established supply caches at each location, storing ammunition, basic medical supplies, and emergency food rations. She also developed multiple escape routes from each position, practicing moving between locations during the darkest hours of night when enemy observation was most limited. The psychological preparation was the most difficult aspect of her transformation. Marija had never killed another human being, and despite her growing hatred of the enemy forces that were destroying her city, she struggled with the moral implications of what she was planning. She spent long hours reading philosophy and ethics texts from the library's collection, searching for intellectual frameworks that would allow her to justify the taking of human life. In the end, the decision became practical rather than philosophical. Every day that the enemy snipers remained active, more innocent people died. Children were shot while playing in courtyards. Elderly people were killed while trying to collect water or find food. Medical personnel were deliberately targeted while trying to help the wounded. Maria began to see her planned actions not as murder, but as a form of defensive warfare designed to protect her community. Her first shot would not be taken lightly or in haste. Maria spent 3 weeks identifying her initial target, a sniper who had positioned himself in a dormitory building about 400 meters from the library. This particular shooter had been responsible for at least 12 civilian deaths, including a pregnant woman who had been killed while hanging laundry to dry. His position overlooked a critical intersection that people needed to cross in order to reach the remaining food distribution point in the neighborhood. Marija studied this target's routine with the same obsessive attention to detail she had once applied to cataloging new book acquisitions. She noted that he typically arrived at his position around 8 in the morning and left around 4 in the afternoon. He took a lunch break between noon and 12:30, during which he would retreat to an interior room. He was left-handed, which meant he positioned himself on the right side of his window to get the best shooting angle. Most importantly, he had developed a habit of standing fully in the window for several seconds each morning while surveying the area below his position. The mathematical calculations were complex but manageable, 412 meters according to her measurements. Elevation difference of approximately 30 to 8 meters. Average wind speed and direction based on 3 weeks of observations. Bullet drop compensation based on her ammunition tests. All of these variables had to be factored into her scope adjustments to ensure a first-round hit. Maria chose her shooting position carefully, a partially collapsed apartment building that provided a clear line of sight to the target while offering multiple escape routes. She arrived at the position 3 hours before dawn on the morning she had selected for her first engagement, giving herself plenty of time to settle in and verify all of her calculations. She used books from the library to create a stable shooting rest, and she arranged debris around her position to provide concealment from observation. As the sun rose over Sarajevo, Maria felt her heart rate increase despite her breathing exercises. Through her scope, she could see the building where her target would soon appear, and she found herself thinking about all the people who would live or die based on her actions in the next few hours. The weight of that responsibility was almost overwhelming, but she forced herself to focus on the technical aspects of the shot she was about to take. At precisely 8:17 that morning, the enemy sniper appeared in his window right on schedule. He stood there for nearly 10 seconds, completely exposed, apparently scanning the city below for potential targets. Marija had her crosshairs centered on his chest, and she began her final breathing sequence. Inhale slowly, exhale halfway. Hold. Squeeze the trigger smoothly between heartbeats. The rifle fired with a sharp crack that echoed through the empty streets. Through her scope, Maria saw the target stumble backward and disappear from view. She did not wait to confirm the kill. Following her predetermined plan, she immediately began moving toward her first escape route, carrying her rifle and the few pieces of equipment she could not afford to leave behind. 20 minutes later, she was back in the library basement, sitting among the refugees and displaced civilians who had taken shelter there. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was normal. And to anyone watching, she appeared to be the same quiet librarian who had been helping organize food distribution and reading to children. But something fundamental had changed. Maria Petković had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and she had discovered that the transition from protector of books to taker of lives was disturbingly easy to make. The enemy did not immediately realize what had happened. It would be several hours before they found the body and began to understand that someone in the besieged city had the capability and willingness to fight back against their snipers. By that time, Marija was already planning her next engagement, studying her notes and selecting her second target with the same methodical approach she had once used to help students find the perfect book for a research project. The quiet librarian was gone forever, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. But the transformation was not yet complete. That would require time, more targets, and the kind of focused precision that comes only with practice and the gradual numbing of one's conscience to the act of killing. The second kill came 6 days later, and it was easier than Marie had expected it to be. The target was a spotter who worked in coordination with one of the main enemy sniper teams, positioned in a partially destroyed office building about 300 meters from her second shooting position. Unlike her first target, this man was more careful about concealment, but he had made the mistake of establishing a predictable routine for his observation schedule. Maria had spent 3 days mapping his pattern of movement before she took the shot. Every morning at 9:45, he would spend exactly 2 minutes checking the southern approach to his building, positioning himself behind a window where he believed he was invisible from the city below. He was wrong. From her carefully selected position in the ruins of what had once been a small hotel, Maria had a perfect angle on his location during those 2 critical minutes. The shot was taken at a range of 287 meters, and the target dropped immediately. This time, Maria allowed herself 30 seconds to confirm the kill through her scope before beginning her withdrawal. She had learned from military manuals in the library's collection that confirmation was important not just for tactical reasons, but for the psychological adjustment that came with accepting the reality of what she was doing. It was after the third kill that the enemy began to realize they had a serious problem. Marija's third target had been a machine gunner who had been terrorizing a residential area where several families with young children were trapped. She had studied his position for over a week, noting that he emerged from cover every afternoon around 3:30 to clean his weapon and check his ammunition supply. The shot had been taken from 450 meters away, using a window in an abandoned school that provided perfect concealment and multiple escape routes. When the enemy found the third body, they began conducting systematic searches of potential sniper positions in the city below. Marija watched through binoculars as teams of soldiers moved through buildings that might offer shooting angles to their positions, and she realized that her operational security would need to become much more sophisticated if she wanted to continue her campaign. The enemy's response forced Marija to evolve her tactics significantly. She began using multiple shooting positions for each engagement, never firing from the same location twice. She developed a system of false positions where she would leave evidence of her presence without actually using the location for shooting, designed to confuse enemy counter-sniper efforts. Most importantly, she began varying her timing and target selection in ways that would make it difficult for the enemy to predict her next move. Her fourth and fifth kills demonstrated her growing sophistication as an urban warfare specialist. Instead of targeting individual snipers, she began focusing on command and control personnel who coordinated enemy operations. Her fourth target was a communications specialist who managed radio traffic between different sniper positions. Her fifth target was an officer who had been observed conducting planning meetings with sniper teams. Both kills were accomplished using shooting positions that required her to move through the city's sewer system, emerging only long enough to take her shots before disappearing underground again. The psychological impact of her campaign began to become apparent after her fifth confirmed kill. Enemy snipers became much more cautious about exposing themselves, which significantly reduced their effectiveness against civilian targets. More importantly, the enemy began dedicating substantial resources to counter sniper operations, pulling personnel away from other activities to focus on finding and eliminating the threat she represented. Marija's operational methodology became increasingly complex as the stakes grew higher. She began using decoy positions equipped with mannequins and mirrors designed to draw enemy fire and reveal their locations. She established communication dead drops throughout the city, allowing her to coordinate with other resistance fighters without compromising her security. She even began collecting intelligence on enemy movements and positions, passing information to other defenders through a network of contacts she had developed among the library's regular users. The enemy's growing frustration became evident through intercepted radio communications that resistance fighters shared with her. They referred to her as the Ghost and the Invisible Woman, and there was clear evidence that her activities were affecting enemy morale. Several enemy snipers requested transfers away from Sarajevo, claiming that the psychological pressure of being hunted was affecting their ability to function effectively. Marija's sixth kill was her most technically challenging shot to date. The target was an enemy sniper who had learned from the fate of his colleagues and was extremely careful about concealment and movement patterns. She had observed him for 2 weeks without identifying a clear shooting opportunity. Finally, she realized that his caution was also his weakness. His elaborate security procedures required him to signal his position to friendly forces using a small mirror at exactly the same time each morning. The shot required Marija to position herself in a location that was technically within enemy observation range, betting that their focus on finding her usual hiding spots would cause them to overlook a position that was hiding in plain sight. She concealed herself among the rubble of a bombed-out car dealership, using the twisted metal of destroyed vehicles to break up her outline and provide shooting support. The range was over 500 meters, and the target was only visible for approximately 3 seconds. When the shot was successful, Marija knew that she had pushed the limits of her capabilities and her luck. Enemy counter-sniper teams arrived at her target's position within minutes of the shooting, and their search patterns indicated that they were becoming much more sophisticated in their efforts to locate her. She spent nearly 4 hours moving through underground passages and bombed-out buildings before she felt safe enough to return to the library. It was around this time that Marija began to notice changes in herself that went beyond her developing tactical skills. The woman who had once been emotionally affected by sad endings in novels now found herself calculating the most efficient methods for killing human beings, with the same detached analytical approach she had once applied to organizing card catalogs. She slept more soundly than she had since the siege began, despite the fact that she was now engaged in the most dangerous possible activities. The seventh kill marked a turning point in the enemy's response to her activities. Instead of simply trying to find and eliminate her, they began implementing collective punishment measures designed to force the civilian population to betray her location. Enemy forces started targeting civilian areas with increased frequency whenever one of their snipers was killed, clearly hoping that community pressure would lead someone to reveal information about her identity or activities. This escalation forced Marija to confront the broader implications of her actions. While her sniper campaign was certainly saving lives by reducing enemy effectiveness and forcing them to divert resources to counter sniper operations, it was also leading to increased suffering for the very people she was trying to protect. She spent several sleepless nights weighing the moral calculus of her situation, trying to determine whether the benefits of her actions outweighed the costs. The decision to continue came when she witnessed the enemy deliberately targeting a group of children who were playing in what they had believed was a safe courtyard. 3 children were wounded in the attack, including a little girl named Amina, who had been one of the most enthusiastic participants in Marija's library storytime sessions before the war. Watching medical personnel carry Amina's unconscious body to an improvised clinic, Marija realized that the enemy's brutality would continue regardless of her actions. The only question was whether she would fight back or simply bear witness to the destruction of everything she cared about. Her 8th and 9th kills were accomplished during a single engagement that required her to reposition between shots. She had identified 2 enemy observers who were working together to coordinate artillery strikes against civilian targets. Both men were positioned in the same building but on different floors, and they communicated with each other through hand signals visible from her shooting position. The first shot eliminated the spotter on the 4th floor at a range of approximately 400 meters. Maria immediately displaced to a secondary position 60 meters away and fired the second shot before the target on the 6th floor could react to his partner's death. The entire engagement lasted less than 3 minutes, and both shots were successful. By the time enemy quick reaction forces reached the building, she was already moving through predetermined escape routes toward the safety of the library basement. These sequential kills marked the end of Maria's individual hunting phase and the beginning of something much more ambitious and dangerous. Word of her activities had reached other resistance fighters in the city, and she had been contacted by representatives of an organized resistance cell that was planning a major operation against enemy positions. They wanted her expertise and her rifle for a coordinated attack that would target multiple enemy positions simultaneously. The proposal both excited and terrified her. Working with other fighters would multiply her effectiveness and allow her to contribute to larger strategic objectives. But it would also expose her to greater risks and force her to reveal her identity to people who might not be as committed to operational security as she was. After days of consideration, she agreed to participate in the operation, but only if she could maintain control over her own positioning and escape plans. The stage was set for the engagement that would define her legend and establish her reputation as one of the most effective urban warfare specialists in the entire conflict. But as she began planning for coordinated operations with other fighters, Maria could not have imagined that her greatest success would come during 18 minutes that would push her skills and her psychological resilience to their absolute limits. The morning of March 15, 1993, began like many others during the siege of Sarajevo, with the distant rumble of artillery fire and the acrid smell of smoke drifting through the city streets. But for Maria Petković, this would be the day that transformed her from a skilled individual operator into a legend whispered about in military circles for decades to come. What happened in the 18 minutes between 11:42 and 12 a.m. would not only save countless civilian lives, but would also demonstrate the devastating effectiveness that a single determined sniper could achieve under the right circumstances. The operation had been planned for 3 weeks by a resistance cell calling itself the Sarajevo Defense Group. Intelligence reports indicated that enemy forces were preparing for a major offensive designed to capture the city's main hospital and several critical supply routes. The attack was scheduled to begin with coordinated sniper fire from 10 different positions, designed to pin down defenders while assault teams moved into position. Maria's role in the counter-operation was supposed to be relatively limited. She was assigned to neutralize 2 specific enemy snipers positioned in a high-rise apartment building that overlooked the hospital's main entrance. Other resistance fighters would handle the remaining 8 sniper positions using explosives, automatic weapons, and coordinated small unit tactics. The plan called for simultaneous attacks at exactly 11:45 a.m., giving enemy forces no time to adapt or call for reinforcements. 3 days before the operation, Maria conducted her final reconnaissance of the target building. Using binoculars and careful observation over several hours, she confirmed the locations of her 2 assigned targets and began calculating the technical requirements for engaging them. The range would be approximately 370 meters from her chosen shooting position in a partially destroyed office complex. Both targets would need to be eliminated quickly and quietly before they could alert other enemy positions to the beginning of the resistance counterattack. What Maria discovered during her reconnaissance changed everything about the upcoming operation. Through careful observation and some luck, she realized that the enemy had positioned not just 2 snipers in the target building, but 8 different shooters spread across multiple floors. More critically, she identified what appeared to be a command post on the building's 7th floor, where officers were coordinating the planned attack on the hospital. The resistance cell's intelligence had been incomplete. Instead of facing 10 enemy snipers spread across different buildings, they were actually confronting a concentrated force of 18 enemy shooters, with 8 of them positioned in the single building that Maria had been assigned to target. The original plan would leave the majority of enemy snipers intact and ready to massacre both the resistance fighters and the civilian population. Maria faced an impossible decision. She could stick to the original plan and eliminate her 2 assigned targets, knowing that the operation would likely fail and result in catastrophic casualties for both the resistance and the civilian population. Or she could attempt something that had never been tried before, systematically eliminating all 8 enemy positions in the target building during the 18 minutes available before enemy reinforcements could respond to the attack. The technical challenges were staggering. 8 targets spread across multiple floors, ranges varying from 300 to 450 meters, multiple shooting angles required, and the need to maintain complete surprise until the very last shot. Any mistake would alert the remaining targets and result in concentrated return fire that would certainly kill her. Even if everything went perfectly, she would need to average 1 kill every 2.25 minutes while moving between shooting positions and adjusting for different ranges and angles. Maria spent the final 2 days before the operation planning an unprecedented shooting sequence. She identified 4 different shooting positions that would allow her to engage all 8 targets, and she calculated precise routes between positions that would minimize movement time while maintaining concealment. She pre-positioned ammunition and equipment at each location, and she practiced moving between positions until she could transition smoothly, even under extreme stress. The psychological preparation was even more challenging than the technical planning. Maria had killed 9 people over the previous months, but those had been individual engagements spread across weeks or months. What she was planning would require her to become a killing machine for 18 continuous minutes, eliminating targets with mechanical precision while maintaining the mental focus necessary for accurate long-range shooting. She would have no time for doubt, hesitation, or emotional processing of what she was doing. On the morning of the operation, Maria arrived at her first shooting position 2 hours before the scheduled start time. She used the extra time to verify her equipment, confirm her range calculations, and practice her breathing exercises. Through her scope, she could see enemy snipers moving around their positions with casual confidence, apparently unaware that their routine morning preparations were being observed by someone who was planning their deaths with methodical precision. At exactly 11:42 a.m., explosions began erupting throughout the city as other resistance teams initiated their attacks on different enemy positions. Maria immediately engaged her first target, a sniper positioned on the building's 3rd floor who was preparing to fire on hospital personnel. The shot was taken at 380 meters, and the target dropped instantly. Without pausing to confirm the kill, Maria immediately began moving toward her second shooting position. Her second target was eliminated 30 seconds later from a position that provided a completely different angle of attack. This sniper had been positioned to cover the hospital's emergency entrance, and his elimination would save the lives of medical personnel who needed to move wounded civilians to safety. The range was 412 meters, requiring Maria to adjust her scope settings while moving between positions. The 3rd and 4th kills came in rapid sequence from her 3rd shooting position, which allowed her to engage 2 enemy snipers who were positioned on the same floor but on opposite sides of the building. These shots required her to pivot between targets without repositioning, using the same scope settings but adjusting her aim point to account for different angles. Both targets were eliminated within 45 seconds of each other. It was at this point that the remaining enemy snipers began to realize they were under attack. Maria could see movement and apparent confusion in the target building as the survivors tried to understand what was happening. Some moved away from windows, while others began scanning the city below for signs of the shooter, who was systematically eliminating their positions. Her 5th target presented the greatest technical challenge of the engagement. This sniper had moved away from his window after hearing the sound of Maria's previous shots, and he was now positioned deeper inside the building, where he was partially concealed behind furniture and debris. Maria had to wait nearly 3 minutes for him to present a clear target, and when the shot opportunity finally came, she had less than 2 seconds to acquire the target and fire before he disappeared again. The 6th kill required Maria to move to her 4th and final shooting position, which provided access to the upper floors of the target building where the most experienced enemy snipers had been positioned. This movement took nearly 4 minutes and brought her dangerously close to the enemy building, but it was the only way to achieve the shooting angles necessary for the remaining targets. Target number 7 was eliminated from a range of only 260 meters, but the shot was complicated by the fact that the target was moving between positions and was only visible for brief moments as he passed by different windows. Maria had to track his movement pattern and time her shot to intersect his path as he moved from one room to another. The 8th and final target was the most dangerous, because he had identified Maria's approximate position and was actively trying to locate her for a countershot. This enemy sniper was clearly the most experienced of the group, and he was using proper tactical movement and concealment techniques that made him a difficult target to acquire. The final engagement became a brief but deadly game of cat and mouse, with both snipers trying to locate each other while remaining concealed from observation. Maria's final shot of the engagement was taken at 12 a.m. exactly, 18 minutes after she had fired her first round. The target was eliminated at a range of 395 meters, just as he was preparing to fire at what he believed was her position. In reality, Maria had moved again, and was shooting from an angle he had not anticipated. When the shooting stopped, 8 enemy snipers were dead and the planned attack on the hospital had been completely disrupted. But the full scope of Maria's achievement became clear only when other resistance fighters began reporting the results of the broader operation. While most of the other resistance teams had succeeded in neutralizing their assigned targets, 3 teams had been killed or wounded when they encountered stronger enemy positions than expected. Maria's elimination of 8 targets instead of her assigned 2 had compensated for these losses and ensured the overall success of the mission. The enemy response was swift and massive. Within 30 minutes of the engagement, artillery shells began falling throughout the neighborhood where Maria had conducted her shooting. Enemy forces launched systematic searches of every building within a kilometer radius of the target location. Helicopter gunships were brought in to provide aerial observation and fire support. The enemy was clearly desperate to find and eliminate the sniper who had single-handedly destroyed their offensive capability. But Maria was already gone. Following her predetermined escape plan, she had moved through underground passages and bombed out buildings to reach a safe house nearly 2 kilometers away from the engagement area. By the time enemy search teams reached her shooting positions, she was drinking tea and helping to treat wounded resistance fighters in a basement clinic that served as both medical facility and temporary headquarters for the Sarajevo Defense Group. The immediate tactical impact of the 18-minute engagement was enormous. The enemy offensive against the hospital was postponed indefinitely, saving dozens of civilian lives and maintaining access to critical medical services for the besieged population. Enemy sniper operations throughout the city were significantly reduced as commanders became reluctant to expose their shooters to counter sniper fire. Most importantly, the demonstration that a single skilled defender could neutralize an entire enemy sniper unit led to increased recruitment and morale among resistance forces. But the psychological impact was even greater than the tactical success. Word of the engagement spread quickly through both military and civilian networks, creating a legend that would inspire defenders throughout the siege and beyond. Enemy forces began referring to her as the Devil Woman and the Invisible Death, and there were reports that some enemy snipers were requesting transfers rather than face the possibility of being targeted by her. For Maria herself, the 18 minutes represented both her greatest triumph and the point of no return in her transformation from civilian to warrior. She had demonstrated capabilities that surprised even her, but she had also crossed psychological barriers that could never be rebuilt. The quiet librarian who had once wept over sad stories was gone forever, replaced by someone harder and more dangerous than she had ever imagined she could become. The weeks following the 18-minute engagement brought both triumph and torment for Maria Petković. Her extraordinary feat had saved countless lives and dealt a devastating blow to enemy operations, but it had also painted an enormous target on her back. Every intelligence asset the enemy possessed in Sarajevo was now dedicated to identifying and eliminating the sniper who had humiliated their forces so completely. The quiet anonymity that had protected her for months was gone forever, replaced by a manhunt of unprecedented intensity. Enemy forces began implementing increasingly desperate measures to find her. They offered substantial rewards to anyone who could provide information about the mystery sniper, and they started conducting house-to-house searches in areas where they suspected she might be operating. Most disturbingly, they began targeting civilians who they believed might be providing support or shelter to resistance fighters, creating a climate of terror designed to isolate her from potential allies. Maria found herself forced to abandon many of her established routines and safe houses. The library basement where she had spent so many months helping displaced civilians was no longer safe, as enemy intelligence reports had correctly identified it as a resistance gathering point. She had to say goodbye to the children she had been reading to, and the elderly refugees who had come to depend on her organizational skills and emotional support. The psychological toll of her transformation became increasingly apparent during this period. Maria discovered that she could no longer enjoy many of the activities that had once brought her pleasure. Reading fiction became difficult because she found herself analyzing every character interaction in terms of tactical advantages and potential threats. She could no longer listen to children's laughter without automatically scanning the surrounding area for sniper positions that might threaten them. Sleep became elusive and fragmented. When she did manage to rest, her dreams were filled with the precise moment when each of her targets had fallen, replayed with the kind of vivid detail that made it impossible to forget the human cost of her expertise. She began to understand why her father had sometimes awakened screaming during her childhood, though he had never explained what had happened during his own military service in previous conflicts. Despite these personal struggles, Maria's operational effectiveness continued to increase. The intensity of the enemy manhunt had forced her to develop even more sophisticated tactics and security procedures. She began working exclusively at night, using darkness and her intimate knowledge of the city's underground passages to move between positions without detection. She established a network of weapons caches and safe houses that would allow her to continue operating even if some of her resources were discovered and compromised. Her 11th confirmed kill came 3 weeks after the 18-minute engagement, when she eliminated an enemy intelligence officer who had been coordinating the search efforts against her. This target represented a significant operational challenge because he was heavily protected and rarely exposed himself to observation. Marija spent nearly 2 weeks studying his security protocols before identifying a brief vulnerability during his weekly inspections of forward observation posts. The shot was taken from over 600 meters away, pushing the absolute limits of her rifle's effective range. More importantly, the kill sent a clear message to enemy forces that even their most protected personnel were vulnerable to her attacks. The psychological impact was immediate and significant. Several high-ranking enemy officers began refusing to visit forward positions, and there were reports of increased tension and paranoia among enemy command personnel. Her 12th and 13th kills were accomplished during a single-night operation that targeted 2 enemy snipers who had been brought in specifically to hunt for her. These counter-snipers were experienced professionals who understood urban warfare and had been briefed extensively on her tactics and capabilities. Eliminating them required Marija to use deception and misdirection techniques that went far beyond simple marksmanship. She spent 3 nights creating false evidence of her presence in buildings throughout the city, leaving spent shell casings, improvised shooting rests, and other signs that would suggest she had been operating from those locations. When the enemy counter-snipers positioned themselves to observe these false positions, she was able to locate and eliminate them from directions they had not anticipated. Both shots were taken within 30 minutes of each other, demonstrating that her tactical sophistication had evolved far beyond what anyone might have expected from a former librarian. The 14th kill marked the beginning of the end of Marija's active sniper career. The target was an enemy communications specialist who had been intercepting and decoding resistance radio transmissions. His elimination was operationally necessary, but the engagement required her to operate in an area that was heavily patrolled by enemy forces actively searching for her. During her withdrawal from the shooting position, she was spotted by an enemy patrol and had to fight her way out using pistol skills she had learned but never expected to need. The firefight lasted only a few minutes, but it shattered the invisibility that had been her greatest tactical advantage. Enemy forces now had witness accounts of her appearance, her equipment, and her general operational area. More critically, they had physical evidence in the form of blood traces that proved she had been wounded during the engagement. While the wound was minor, a grazing bullet wound to her left shoulder, it meant that enemy forces now knew she was mortal and vulnerable. The intensity of the enemy response to her exposure forced resistance leadership to make a difficult decision. Marija's value as an operational asset was enormous, but her continued presence in Sarajevo was drawing enemy attention and resources that threatened other resistance activities. After extensive discussion, it was decided that she should be evacuated from the city and relocated to a safer area where she could train other resistance fighters in advanced marksmanship and urban warfare techniques. Marija's final confirmed kill in Sarajevo came during her extraction operation. As resistance fighters moved her toward an evacuation point on the city's outskirts, they were ambushed by an enemy patrol that had been waiting along one of the primary escape routes. During the firefight, Marija identified and eliminated the enemy machine gunner who was pinning down her escort team, allowing them to break contact and complete the evacuation successfully. The shot was taken at close range under extreme stress, demonstrating that months of combat had transformed her into a complete warrior capable of effective action under any circumstances. But it was also the end of an extraordinary chapter in the siege of Sarajevo, as the woman who had terrorized enemy forces for nearly a year disappeared into the mountains of Bosnia and was never seen in the city again. Marija's total confirmed kill count during her time in Sarajevo was 15 enemy soldiers, accomplished over a period of 11 months using tactics and techniques that revolutionized urban sniper warfare. Military analysts who studied her methods after the war concluded that her individual contribution to the defense of Sarajevo was equivalent to that of an entire infantry company, both in terms of enemy casualties inflicted and operational disruption achieved. But perhaps more importantly, her example inspired dozens of other defenders to take up arms against the siege. The knowledge that a single determined individual could make such a significant difference in the conflict motivated many civilians to join resistance activities, contributing to the overall defensive effort that eventually succeeded in maintaining the city's independence. After the war ended, Maria returned to Sarajevo and attempted to resume her civilian life. The library where she had worked was heavily damaged but still standing, and city authorities offered her the position of head librarian as recognition of her service during the siege. She accepted the job and spent several years helping to rebuild the library's collection and restore its role as a community resource. However, the transition back to civilian life proved more difficult than she had expected. Maria found herself unable to concentrate on library work for extended periods, and she suffered from severe insomnia and anxiety that made normal social interactions challenging. She began experiencing panic attacks when she heard sudden loud noises, and she could not tolerate being in crowded spaces where she could not observe all potential threats. Eventually, Maria made the difficult decision to leave Sarajevo permanently. She relocated to a small mountain village where the pace of life was slower and the environment reminded her of the hunting trips she had taken with her father before the war. There, she found some measure of peace working as a teacher in the local school and helping village children learn to read and appreciate literature. She never spoke publicly about her experiences as a sniper, and most of the children she taught had no idea that their quiet, gentle teacher had once been one of the most feared combatants in the Bosnian War. When former resistance fighters occasionally visited her to reminisce about the siege, she would listen politely, but rarely contributed to the conversations about their shared experiences. Maria Petković died in 2018 at the age of 60, having lived more than 2 decades beyond the war that had transformed her from librarian to legend. Her funeral was attended by dozens of former resistance fighters and Sarajevo residents whose lives had been saved by her actions during the siege. Many speakers talked about her courage and skill, but perhaps the most fitting tribute came from one of the children she had taught during the war. Amina Markovic, whose sister Anna had been killed in the school bombing that had motivated Maria to take up arms, was now a successful doctor working in Sarajevo's rebuilt hospital. She spoke about how Maria had continued reading stories to the children in the library basement even during the worst periods of the siege, providing comfort and hope when the adult world seemed to have lost both qualities entirely. After Maria's death, the full scope of her wartime activities became public knowledge when her personal papers were donated to the Sarajevo War Museum. The detailed notes she had kept during her sniper career provided invaluable historical documentation of resistance activities during the siege, and they revealed the extraordinary level of planning and professionalism that had made her so effective. Military historians now regard Maria Petković as one of the most successful urban warfare specialists of the late 20th century, and her techniques are studied in military academies around the world. But perhaps more significantly, her story serves as a reminder that extraordinary courage and capability can emerge from the most ordinary circumstances when ordinary people are faced with impossible choices. The woman who had once helped children discover the magic of fairy tales had written her own story, one of transformation, sacrifice, and the terrible price that some people pay to protect the things they love. It was not the ending she would have chosen for herself, but it was the ending that history demanded, and she had answered that demand with a precision and dedication that will be remembered long after the scars of war have faded from the streets of Sarajevo. In the rebuilt library that now bears her name, visitors can find a small memorial plaque that reads simply, Maria Petković, 1958-2018. Librarian, teacher, defender of Sarajevo. But for those who understand the full story, those few words contain the entire epic of a woman who discovered that sometimes the greatest act of love is learning how to kill in defense of the innocent.